So, hey everyone, we have Ann with us today, and Ann, I think you are one of our very first team members over here. That sounds so weird to say team member. It's like
Sure.
Disney calls it, like what, castmates or something. I feel like there's something just cheesy about that term, but you're one of the first people we've had at Data Central going back many, many years, and you've worked on so many amazing reports and stuff, and now Anne leads our content team, which is just cranking out so much high quality stuff. So we're going to look at some of the more data oriented reports that we published recently in our forecast for 2024. But Anne, we're really happy to have you today, and I think you're going to have a lot of wonderful stuff to share with everyone. So with that being said, I think a lot of you have already started chatting. Keep doing it. This is really all about the conversation that's generated as much as it is about the content that Anne's going to be sharing today. So if you have questions, comments, thoughts, or you just want to say something to everyone else across the industry, this is the perfect time to do it. And I actually wanted to crowdsource something. So I've been trying to eat a little bit healthier in my life. I'm like, oh my God, this is not going so well. So what do I do to improve this? And I'm getting sort of stuck, oh my God, I'm eating the same stuff all the time. So I'd like to just crowdsource to everyone, and maybe we could sort of share what is it, whether it's restaurant food or something you can make easily at home, what's something that's both healthy and delicious? And you could use whatever definition of healthy and whatever definition of delicious that you would like. But let's get some ideas flowing, and maybe we could inspire one another. And I'm going to use those ideas and integrate them into my personal life. And if you could do what's healthy and delicious in Washington, D.C., that's even better. But in general is perfectly fine. So I don't know, Anne, are we getting any thoughts, or is it taking people a little more time to summon something?
Well, people have ideas. Yeah, there's some I can't quite tell. Like the first person, bacon was the first reply. I can't tell if that's a little tongue in cheek, but a lot of hummus, avocados, pistachios.
So people are going
healthy fats.
But I want not just ingredients, but like a dish, something you might get at a restaurant. Something that goes beyond just ingredient level would be good. So what's both healthy and delicious? Think about it, and you can just keep the hour.
Yeah.
So we'll be like
poke bowls.
You'll be talking about unit growth at QSR, and someone will just pop something up on the screen. That's totally fine. Just keep the ideas coming. Okay. Yeah. So as most, if not all of you know, we have a wonderful program called Report Pro, where we publish brand new content basically almost every day now. Well over 1,000 reports on every topic imaginable across the world of food, with more of an emphasis on food service. And something that we just published recently are a series of reports. And I want to show you one first, which is our Gen Alpha preview. Real quick read on learning the A, B's, and C's of Gen Alpha, that next generation consumer after Gen Z, and something we're all going to have to be thinking more and more about. So go check that out in Report Pro. We have a great snacking report as well. This one's a deeper dive. It's going to take a little bit longer to get through, but there's just so much information. It's chock full of nuts, popcorn, crackers, and everything else that you might imagine. It's fantastic. It shows you the perspective from consumers, what's happening on menus, and everything else that is going on across the landscape of food. And then finally, we have these segment guides, which are awesome. These were also published just very, very recently. And these are sort of semi-short, semi-quick reads for all the most important things you want to know about a particular segment. So whether it's healthcare that you see at the top, or some of the ones you see towards the bottom of the screen, lodging, B&I, CNU, K through 12. If you want just a quick hit of what are the most important things you want to know about a segment, really up to date, all of those segment guides are now available for you in Report Pro. So if you don't have Report Pro yet, talk to your favorite Data Central person, and they'll help get you set up with that. But today's focus, and Anne's going to basically take over and steal the show, is our 2024 industry forecast. There's a document, there's a report in Report Pro as well that gives you some of the high level beats. But today we're gonna go a little bit deeper and show you some of the things that we think are gonna matter in the world of food service for 2024 and beyond. And Anne has been the master of food service industry size, unit count, growth numbers, what's happening with the general economy, all of that macro stuff. She has been the master of that here at Data Central, is going to share some of her personal insight as well. So, and with that, I think I'm just going to sort of turn things over to you and just add a little commentary as we go. So, Anne, the mic is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Jack. And I will say we put these numbers together in conjunction with IFMA, and you'll see at the end there's a bunch more stuff on their website. We kind of have a report that does sort of a top line look at the industry, and their website, the IFMA Scope site, has a bunch more detail as well. So again, there'll be info later to where you can find that. So, but first, sort of in looking at sort of trying to size the industry and what we're expecting of folks, you know, we take a macro look. So first, we're going to sort of dive into some big picture numbers and kind of get a sense of the macroeconomic situation we're facing. So unemployment, you know, obviously, I think probably most people are not going to be surprised by anything they're seeing here. You know, we obviously had that huge spike around COVID, and we're now sort of down at, you know, this is sort of the last decade of unemployment, and we're sort of seeing historical lows. And that's obviously impacting food service. One theme you'll see throughout this is how, you know, labor shortages are really impacting food service, right? It's in many ways really limiting how much revenue the industry can bring in, right? I mean, Jack did a whole thing about shorter hours, right? Because restaurants literally can't find enough workers to stay open. And so, you know, this is employment's a key part of the industry that's certainly limiting growth for food service right now.
Yeah, and I think one thing to think about is the official unemployment rate number is not a very complex or thoughtful number. It doesn't take into consideration how many hours you worked, whether it was overtime, or, you know, someone that worked 1 hour for that week is counted the same as someone who worked 60 hours for that week. And it largely includes gig economy stuff too. So if you're driving Uber or doing a DoorDash delivery, and you're only doing that for a few hours a week, you sort of get counted in this number as well.
Yeah, so another thing we sort of look at is labor force participation. So again, you know, hit a real dip during COVID, but even sort of ignoring that little dip, if we look past, you know, the last 10 years, you know, we are seeing lower levels than we were, right? So again, you know, fewer workers out there means, you know, it's a little harder for, you know, food service operators to staff their operation, and that is constraining how much growth we've seen kind of in the recent year or so.
Yeah, and you can see there's been that sort of broad decline in labor force participation for a number of years part of COVID, but we're now just starting to maybe recover to something that looks like a just before COVID number. I mean, I don't think it's going to reverse that long-term trend, though. That seems unlikely to happen. So we might be getting close to a top.
Mm-hmm. So getting a little more detailed, looking sort of more at food service specifically. So this is a shorter time frame, sort of the last year or so. But we can kind of see that we're sort of leveling off on the food service unemployment rate, you know, but the industry is adding jobs, right? So we still see those food service employment numbers, you know, sort of steadily increasing. You know, I think as we sort of slowly ramp up post-COVID, we are continuing to, you know, add more food service jobs, which is a good sign for the industry.
Yeah. Do you think this number continues to go up and up, Anne? I mean, or do you have a thought that maybe the industry just doesn't need as many workers as it did prior to COVID with all the automation and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. I think there was a lot of investment in technology and sort of a, you know, a move away from, you know, human labor to other things. So, you know, I'm sure we'll level off, you know, like smaller than we were for pre-COVID levels. You know, where that exactly is, I'm not sure. As we'll sort of get into, you know, we're not expecting gangbusters growth for the industry either over the next year or two. So, you know, so we're probably going to see that, you know, food service employment number level off a little bit.
I would agree. Sentiment. What is this showing us?
Yeah. So what are consumers thinking? So I've kind of got two things. This is the same number on the page. So, you know, sort of the consumer sentiment index. But I kind of wanted to show both things here. One is, you know, kind of the annualized number on one side of the screen. And you can kind of see that we're, you know, it doesn't look great. We're definitely kind of a little bit lower. Consumers are feeling a little more nervous about things, a little more pessimistic. But I think it's interesting if we look at sort of the monthly numbers on the other side of the screen, kind of how much variation there is from month to month. And we'll sort of see this in a few other numbers we're presenting where I feel like consumers are just a little bit lost right now. They're sort of not really sure. I mean, we all are, right? We're sort of like, you know, is the recession coming? Is it not? So, there can be a lot of variation from month to month, and like, I actually feel pretty good. Things are okay this month. And then a month later, things kind of head a little downhill again. So a lot of variation and uncertainty, I think, is what I kind of take away from these numbers.
Yeah, so I think the news back then in 2022 is this thing hit like what, a 50-year low or something, from like as low as from the time they started tracking this. But it looks like 2023 has gotten a little bit better than 2022. So still nowhere near a historic high, probably not even near a historic medium, but better than we saw last year.
Exactly. So this comes from our own data. So this is sort of our operator database, and it's focused on restaurants and kind of understanding restaurant units. So there's sort of a few things going on this page. I know it's a lot, but we sort of have the bars that you see kind of going up and down the screen are the number of restaurant units in the US. And then there's two lines. The green line is new openings and the red line is permanent closures. So you can kind of see, pre-COVID, we had more openings than we had closures, and you see that sort of total number of restaurants going up. And then, of course, we saw a lot of closures, more closures than opening. And so the green line started to head downhill. So, as we kind of look closer to right now, we saw it flip a little bit. So maybe, units are starting to increase a little bit in the restaurant space, which is a good sign for the industry. Or at the very least, we've definitely seen a little more sort of leveling off there, which is a good sign for the industry.
Yeah, and we should say that, unit count is not like a one-to-one proxy for total, food service restaurant revenues or something, right? You could have units increase a lot, but revenues go up only a little bit, which means the average restaurant is making maybe a little bit less than it did before, but there's more of them in total. And I think we saw quite a bit of, that type of a thing where we saw unit counts grow pretty aggressively from 2018 into 2020. That was a decent size increase. And then all of a sudden, like you said, that green line, which is brand new openings, finally dipped below the red line as soon as COVID hit. And it basically has not returned to being consistently above the red line, which is closures, since. I mean, from March of 2020 all the way through nearly the end of 2022, that red line was above the green line. And now they're finally getting to a place where they're sort of like, intertwining a little bit, which means that we've sort of stabilized. So that 800,000 or so restaurants that we have right now, that seems like that's probably going to be sort of like the stabilized number, pending some change to the economy. So I think that's generally good. And we're going to start seeing places open up that were previously, scared to open up or weren't able to open up or couldn't find workers to open up. And that should be a generally positive thing. I mean, I don't know if you see it differently, Anne, in any way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And someone in chat brought up a good point. We'll see, new openings might require some capital investment. So, right, as long as interest rates are high, that might be a little bit of a barrier to sort of any rapid increase. But I think, we've seen, we lost a lot of restaurants there, and I think we're starting to find kind of a new equilibrium.
There was I think a service out in like the San Francisco Bay Area. I think it was called Josephine maybe a few years ago. And I think there's been others that try to creep up where they wanted to do like the Uber or the Airbnb for like prepared foods. So people would just make food in their home kitchen and sell it basically as restaurant food. And I think like some legislation like shot that thing down, but it feels like something like that might eventually come to pass. I mean, the same way it's done. So maybe, eventually that 800,000 restaurants becomes like 18 million restaurants at some point. So we'll see.
Yeah. So another thing we're sort of trying to understand the big picture here is sort of what are operators telling us, right? So this is data from, our operator panel. And we asked them, this is sort of month over month, are you expecting things to be better next month than they were last month? And pretty positive results here, right? Operators, for the most part, are more optimistic than they are pessimistic. There's 66 times as many are expecting higher sales next month than lower sales next month. So again, another sort of like positive sign for kind of what us operators are seeing.
Yeah, and I think to Ann's point, the way you'd want to interpret this chart, right, with the 3 lines, do you think your sales will be higher, the same, or lower? The number in any given period doesn't matter because it's very unlikely to map to reality. It's the perception of an operator. What you want to look at is the trend line and where numbers are today versus historically. Because if operators are actually right, well, they're not, right? They've been, a majority say it's going to be higher pretty much any month over the past few years, and it's obviously that doesn't end up being the case. What I would sort of focus on the most is if you look at sort of the distance between that green line and the red line, and you could see how that red line was creeping up near to that green line in December of 2022, but now we have pretty nice separation again. Basically similar to what we saw towards the beginning of this year. We saw a little bit of compression, and now we have a little bit more breathing room in terms of operator optimism. And what does optimism mean from an operator? Well, it means maybe they're more open to menu innovation, trying something different, upgrading some things to take on this, to take advantage of what they think is going to be increased sales in the period ahead, probably more open to ideas, probably more able to engage on things beyond just the basics if you're a manufacturer or distributor selling into them. So I think that's pretty positive.
Yeah, and a good comment, Jack, in the chat, Jack, about how, some of that optimism probably is price increases, right? So, it's hard on a day-to-day basis to sort of, you forget that, right? That, we'll see this again. We are going to dive into some inflation stuff where, the dollars are there and maybe that's, more just inflation driven than it is sort of a real growth, right? So, operators have a little bit of a harder time seeing that difference too. So great example of this slide, right? Operators, we also ask them, like, what are your challenges right now? Rising food costs, top of list, probably no surprise there. Labor costs, inflation. So we're still seeing a lot of the challenges that have kind of plagued the industry the last few years. I mean, even, ingredient shortages, I feel like are much less top of mind, but 18% of operators still say that's a really pressing challenge for them. So again, there's sort of optimism when you look at the dollars, right? And sort of how we're sort of feeling month to month. But there's still a lot of challenges that operators are facing as well.
Yeah, and if you look at the staff stuff, right, you have recruiting and hiring hourly staff versus recruiting and hiring managers. There's a pretty big gap there, right? And I think we've seen this in a lot of the prior work, and this goes back probably a couple years now at this point, as far as labor shortage go. If you ask operators like, hey, where are you most short-staffed? Tends to be in like prep cooks and sort of back of house people doing some of the more basic aspects of labor, as opposed to the managers and GMs. 32% for hourly staff versus just 9% for managers in terms of challenges, which is a big difference.
Mm-hmm. So we also ask consumers how they're feeling about things. And I will say all this data comes from our table stakes report. So, and we do have historical data for all these numbers. We've sort of been doing these surveys since August of last year, and we do them every month. So we do have some historical data in Report Pro if you look at our table stakes reports. There's another one where we ask consumers just like overall, do you feel like you're, falling behind or getting ahead financially? We also have a getting by, but we took that line off because again, I feel like as Jack's point earlier, what's interesting is sort of understanding the difference there, right? Like the share that are falling behind versus the share that are getting ahead. And you can kind of see, a little bit of narrowing. Again, the falling behind group is a little more up and down, and then the sort of getting ahead group is a little more steady. And I would say the trend is towards the line getting sort of closer together, Jack. I don't know, but it's a little hard to tell at this point.
I would say the same thing. I mean, again, I think we should look at the gaps. Where is how big is the separation between the red and the green in any period? So August of 2022, you had a 20-point gap, 29 falling behind versus 9% getting ahead. That's shrunk to just 10% in the most recent period. So what's happened during that time, right? The rate of inflation, even though inflation is still positive and we're probably not getting back to the prices that we had in the past, the rate of inflation has slowed considerably during that time. So I think like there was probably a period where, every week or every month as a consumer, you felt like you're just getting like walloped with another unexpected like price hike or expense. That's moderated substantially. And I think that's what's led to a decline in that red line. Now, it's not as though people are saying they're getting ahead at a much higher rate now than they were in the past either. As Ann said, that's tends to be more steady. What would be interesting, I don't know if we could see this from our own data, is I wonder, are the 9% in August of 22, are those the same people as the 7% in 23, or does that group sort of jump around in the population or not? But I think that the distance between the red and the green suggests something that's more positive, with a little less, whiplash for consumers financially than we've seen in the past. So a little more stabilization there, just like we saw in the stabilizing of restaurant unit counts as well. Not the prettiest picture on earth, but not as crazy and as unexpected as we've seen, same time last year. What about this? What are we seeing here, Ann? Dining out expectations.
Yeah, so this is, again, sort of diving a little bit more into sort of the food service specific. So that prior slide is sort of finances in general, and this is sort of trying to understand consumers' dining out behavior. So again, we sort of have plan to dine out less, plan to dine out more, or keep it the same. Again, the same sort of picture. You can actually just go to the next slide, Jack, which does show the difference between the red and the green. So you can kind of see how, again, I feel like a lot of that variation comes from the sort of plan to dine out less crowd. They get a little bit pessimistic, but I think we're sort of starting to see it went positive in June, so that's a good sign. And then I think we're sort of seeing a little bit maybe of a flatter line going forward, which is a good sign for the industry.
Yeah, so I think that's not bad, right? So basically people sort of started figuring things out, and they don't feel the same need to commit to some sort of a cutback that they previously felt, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this other piece of information, and this is pretty consistent with what we saw when the economy first started seeming like, there was going to be potentially some challenges. And we asked people, were you most likely to cut if you were going to cut? And what do we see today, Ann?
Yeah. And I think this is intuitive, and things we've seen with sort of past economic cutbacks, right? Food service is an area that gets hit more quickly than some of the other areas, right? Consumers will cut back on dining out, and we'll sort of see ahead. The one thing I will say for this slide is that, we aren't quantifying what that cutback is, right? So, it's just sort of like, will you reduce that spending? And so, is that just a 10% reduction or a 50% reduction? We're not measuring it with this number, but we do know that food service is an area that, if a recession hits, that will get hit harder than, some of these other categories, right? Consumers do cut back on that food service spending.
Yeah, I mean, as all of you look at this list of things, does this, comport with your own personal lives? I mean, I think for me, I would actually guess for maybe many of us, it's different because we are of the industry that maybe, we're going to support that top thing more. But the rest of it seems like, I don't know, like fairly like similar to maybe the way I behave. But it's, when I think about these numbers, like, I don't know if that really makes a whole lot of sense. Like, why is e-commerce so down over there? Like, I figure I buy so much useless stuff on Amazon. It's like, oh wow, this flashlight looks like it's brighter than other flashlights, I should buy it. I don't need that stupid flashlight. Like, I should cut that stuff out, right? There's a lot of other stuff that you could probably cut it. And one thing we saw, particularly during the pandemic, but I think more generally, is like going out and eat at a restaurant is really good for like your mental health, really, right? It can aid with stress, and it's good for your psychological well-being. Versus that super bright flashlight probably just gives you anxiety, because a brighter flashlight's going to come out the very next week, and you have to buy that piece of crap too. So, and then also I wonder, why are people cutting back on restaurants and dining out more than, let's say, alcoholic beverages? That's a big difference as well. So, all interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, is this a question?
All this sort of sums. Yes, there's sort of some, so, as we're sort of trying to put together what's next for the industry, the question, right? Are we headed toward a recession or not?
I guess.
Go to the next slide, Jack. Go ahead. Okay, so I wanted to define recession, because I feel like people talk about it a lot, and it's sort of like, what does that even mean, right? And you'll see this sort of plays into kind of how we put together our numbers going forward as well. but technically a recession is sort of a reduction in the size of the economy for 2, consecutive quarters, right? And if you look at GDP growth, obviously during COVID, we saw major contractions. We also technically saw a bit of a, arguably a recession, although economists are sort of tweaking their idea of a recession in early 2022 as well, right? So, we're sort of trying to see, are we going to have those, 2 consecutive quarters? What's it going to look like? And what's it going to mean for food service? We're sort of seeing GDP growth is certainly, a little lower than it was pre-COVID, but is still positive and is kind of hanging on right now. So we're trying to understand, big picture recession, what's coming and what that means for food service was something we discussed a lot as a team. We're sort of trying to figure out our numbers.
So maybe here's a question. We'll do like an impromptu poll of everyone. You can do this just in chat. We won't have a survey pop up. So without avoiding any political statement, if you can, I guess the question is, do you think A, we are headed toward something like a recession, B, we're not headed toward it, or C, we actually already had one? And I'm curious to see what everyone says. I mean, and I guess like in a strict technical definition, wouldn't you say that we were there already in 2022, or is that the word generally?
So yeah, yes, right. Yep. No, and you sort of stealing my thunder here a little bit, Jack, with what's on the next slide, and sort of how we're defining this for Data Central, at least for kind of our group. And chat, it's interesting. In chat, I would say, I don't know, it was almost like an equal mix of A, B, and C. So highlighting how unsure we all are of, what is this economic environment we're in, and how do we define it and talk about it. So so yeah, when we were sort of looking at, reading what all the economists were saying and trying to understand what it would mean for food service specifically, I kind of fell into this term called the rolling recession. I don't know if you're familiar with this at all, Jack, or if folks in chat have heard of it, but it really sort of spoke to me as I feel like what we've been reading and seeing for the industry. And basically the notion is that, different industries are getting hit at different times, such that overall GDP manages to stay afloat. And it's not to say that there aren't sort of recessionary, components of the economy or certain industries that are sort of feeling very recessionary right now, but it's sort of happening to different industries at different times, such that, overall we're kind of hanging on, right? And maybe that's the sort of soft recession. But I think, to say it's a soft recession means there's no impact or you don't feel it at all. And I'm not sure that's quite right either. So I kind of like this notion of a rolling recession. And I don't know if you agree, Jack, or have thoughts. But.
Well, yeah, I guess like for me, there's a couple, I feel like the word recession becomes so binary. It's like, do we have one or we're not having one? We're really like, you look at the numbers and that tells you so much more. So I think we over focus on the word and under focus on the number that tells you a much more complete story as opposed to it being purely black and white. At the same time, though, I don't get the point of defining something if you're just going to change the definition of it. That's not someone, this is generally a hamburger when it's, ground beef between 2 buns. I don't know. So is this thing a hamburger or not? I don't know. It's pretty close to a hamburger. You just look at the item as a whole. Yeah, that's pretty close to a hamburger. I'm not going to have to be forced to label it as such or not. You look at the entirety, and I think for us, that means looking at the numbers and you can see where we are versus history. So. So let's take a look.
Yep.
2020. This is depressing.
Yeah. So yes, I know. And I almost didn't want to include this, except that I think the reason I sort of have this in there, again, sort of bringing this the notion of a rolling recession. And we've seen all the headlines of consumers arguably shouldn't be spending, but they are. And why is that? And trying to understand what's going on. And I think part of that is in some ways, food service, we kind of had our recession. We paid a lot of dues in 2020, right? And so I think there's this element of all that pent up demand, those, cravings for experiences and going out that I think, even if a, more traditional recession does hit, I think it's not going to hit food service as hard as it has historically because we've kind of been hit a little bit already. So.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm glad you didn't make the font red. So that's good, but it is still depressing. I remember, being in this industry for a while,
I know.
you talk to other people in, the business and the world of business, say, hey, you know what, I like your industry because people still got to eat no matter what. And then all of a sudden 2020 came along. It's like, oh, they're not able to go out and eat. So that's different.
Sadness.
Headwinds.
Yeah, and there are, we're starting on a little bit of a negative note here, but I did want to get this out of the way of some of the other things. Recession obviously is like one of the big things that's potentially going to hold us back. There are other things that are holding back the industry, right? The labor challenges are continuing. We're seeing some of those supply chain challenges. There's a lot of shifts to consumer behavior that are still impacting the industry, like remote first work policies. Student debt repayments, a big one. Everyone's sort of talking about what's going to happen when everyone has to start paying back their student debt, and is that going to impact food service? There's a few other things we're sort of keeping our eye on that might, drag down the industry a little bit in the near term.
Yeah. Okay, there's a lot
so,
here.
Inflation, a big part of this. Yes.
Yeah. Let's describe define the colors of each line if we can.
Yes. Okay. So there's 3 different lines here. So, the green line is sort of total food and beverage inflation. The pinkish line is at-home inflation. So those are items you buy from the grocery store. And then away from home inflation is the yellow line, and that's sort of the food service number. So when we're modeling, we use the away from home inflation food service inflation number. And what I wanted to point out here is that a couple things. One is that, we never saw the away from home inflation get as high as at home inflation. We know operators were very reluctant to take those price increases. We finally got everyone back to restaurants after COVID. And so, jacking up prices just didn't feel right. And we wanted to keep that traffic coming in. So we never saw it peak quite as high, which I think has served the industry very well. I do think, we also see it's not coming down quite as quickly. And you'll sort of see our estimates on the next page. And I think that might continue, right? That I think we're not necessarily going to cut back quite as quickly and see a big drop like we did in those at-home food prices. Because I think we're still, kind of struggling with those higher food costs.
Yeah, and if we could double click into this for a moment, because I think this is actually probably particularly important. And I know we have to make some guesses at things because the data is, we probably still need a few more periods of data to know for sure. But the green line is all food. The pink line is just retail food, basically. The yellow line is food service menu prices. Let's say, roughly speaking, you have some other segments of food service as well. Throughout all of COVID and beyond, you basically, other than that one period where like restaurants reopened, you saw a greater rate of inflation at retail than on menus. And I think the story we had back then, and we saw this very consistently from operators, is they said, I'm scared to raise my prices on my menu because I think my customers are going to leave me and I'm getting crunched because my costs are up so much, but I'm just afraid to take these price increases. And then we saw chain restaurants lead the way and take the largest price increases earlier on. And eventually, only in the past several months, we started seeing independents start to take price increases too, but they still had quite a lot of increase they had to take to get anywhere near the level of profitability or target food costs they had pre-pandemic. In this last period that we see all the way to the right of this chart, the yellow line is actually above the pink line considerably, right? So we've seen food inflation decrease at retail, but it hasn't decreased that much yet on menus. And I think that's because there's still a whole lot of food cost targets that the operator has to hit because they didn't take those price increases earlier on. Is it our belief or our forecast, Anne, that yellow line, let's say, will stay above the green and the pink line for the next several periods? Or is it going to revert back to where those lines are?
I mean, I think it's probably going to stay ahead. Yeah, I think it's going to stay higher. I mean, you can go to the next slide, Jack, and see what we actually estimated. And, we are sort of estimating, we're going to kind of get down to 5% by 2024. But, it's going to be, 5% higher than where at-home inflation is already. So, when we first modeled this like last year, we kind of had a bit of a lag. Like we sort of were like, okay, away from home's like going to sort of mirror at home. And, honestly, it was, interesting and a little surprising to us that it never got quite as high as that at-home inflation. But again, I think we're just going to see a bit of a wider curve to the food away from home inflation as opposed to that big spike we saw with at-home inflation.
Yeah,
So that's essentially how we've modeled it.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, you think like, let's say normally my food cost was 30%, and then with all the inflation in my products that I'm buying for my restaurant, now it's like at 41% because I'm afraid to raise my prices. I don't think it's sustainable to say in the long run, okay, this is my new normal. I'm going to be operating at a 41% target food cost. I think you're going to have to continue to raise your prices a bit and get closer to your historic target. So I would agree with you. I think that yellow line is going to stay above the other two, but we'll see. We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, how big is the industry?
Getting into the numbers. Yeah, so we're estimating that 2023 is going to end at about $845 billion in consumer spend. I should specify this is prepared food and non-alcoholic beverages. So, it doesn't include alcohol. That does, it's a large dollar amount that isn't included here. And then 2024 is going to get up to close to $890 billion.
Yeah. So this is the biggest the industry has ever been. And next year will be even larger than that, which is great. But then there's some detail over here to think about what those numbers actually mean. So let's talk about it.
Yes, and this part will not surprise anyone. But again, if we sort of look at those jumps we're seeing from year to year and break it out into, what portion is sort of real growth versus that inflationary dollar growth. We saw some real growth from 2021 to 2022, but then as we sort of look into finishing 2023 and on into 2024, a large portion, the significant portion of the growth is sort of that inflationary growth and not real growth.
Yeah. So, the number of burgers sold, we're not, burger being, let's say, a proxy for all menu items, is we don't think that's really going to increase very much over the next couple of years. But because burger prices will continue to go up, the total value of the burgers sold will be larger, right? So if you're a manufacturer, that maybe translates into the number of cases that you sell. That almost all of the growth for 2024 is going to come from inflation as opposed to an increase in volume. Do we have a thought? I don't know if we've done this for 2025. Will that be an extension of the 2024, mostly pink?
It will. Yep. We do have 2025 numbers as well. You can definitely find them and on Ipmoscope and probably in our report too. I'm actually not positive, but yes, we also are seeing the same kind of trend going towards, inflationary growth, focusing rather than real growth.
Okay. So that's interesting. So that for the next couple of years, it's really going to be price-driven growth more than anything else. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So just a quick snapshot, looking at the segments. Everyone on this call is probably an expert, so no surprises that QSR is driving a lot of the industry. Casual dining, the second largest segment, and then sort of additional fast casual mid-scale, and then some of the on-site and retail segments, kind of carrying a smaller share of the overall consumer dollars.
Yeah, and maybe if we think about where we are today versus pre-COVID, and I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm going to do it anyways because I sort of enjoy it. So I guess I don't really hate it. I sort of like it. Do you think that these numbers, or let's say the proportions, have shifted in any material way versus where the industry was 4 years ago, let's say?
Well, it depends on how you define material. I mean, in a couple of slides, we'll show the sort of like versus 2019, is like, what's material? And I have to think about like percentages or like, is like, 10 billion, is that like material to you? What's the barrier or the cutoff for material?
Well, I think you have it in a couple of slides, right? So let's see when we get there. Here we go.
Onward ho. So this one, and I know it's like a lot of numbers, but people like the numbers for this. So the real takeaway I want you to get from this is like, the 2020 impact was felt by everyone, but was felt kind of unevenly, right? So some of those are much larger negative numbers than others. And then there was some real changes coming out of that, right? Where some segments, had a lot of growth and a lot of ground to make up, whereas others hadn't lost as much during COVID. And so didn't see, kind of huge growth right after. The key takeaway I kind of want you to take away from this is, we're leveling out a little bit, right? So into sort of 2023, 24, 25, we're starting to sort of see a little more sort of pre-COVID levels of like, up and down 1% or 2%, but not these huge swings that we were seeing with COVID and then coming out of COVID.
So basically, things are effectively normal and stable right now. Is that the way of thinking about it? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I think we've found our new normal. So again, to your earlier question about sort of like meaningful changes. So this, again, a little hard to interpret, but I still think it's interesting. So it's a comparison of 2019 dollars versus 2024 dollars, and whether we're sort of like made up and we're back to those pre-COVID dollars. So a lot of this growth is inflation. So, I haven't sort of realized it or changed the dollars to 1 year. So, I wouldn't necessarily think about this in terms of, the actual percent being super meaningful. But I think what's interesting is looking, between segments, right? Which ones have kind of like figured things out and are, much higher or higher than 100% versus those where the dollars really are still lower than they were pre-COVID. So I think, this sort of speaks to some of your shifts, Jack, right? Where it's like, supermarkets, they really benefited from, not being forced to close down and, consumers eager for, easy to prepare at home, rotisserie chickens and all that. So, and that means they're just sort of starting from a better place year over year. And, we all know how compounding interest works and growth, right? And so, they definitely are taking a little bit of a larger share, whereas some of the on-site segments definitely took a bit more of a hit. And so are making up ground a little slower.
So this is great. So if you're at 100%, that means that segment is in the exact same place nominally as it was, as today versus 2019. So I think the things that jump out are, you look at the limited service segments, QSR, and then fast casual, slightly lesser extent. Those are already giant segments that have just sort of really grown substantially, far outpacing what you see in full service restaurants, which are, stable for casual and fine dining. They've actually taken a 10% haircut in mid-scale. The B&I number makes sense. That's lower today than it has been in the past because of all the work from home stuff. And then we see a little bit for lodging as well. So I think these are actually pretty material shifts, especially given how large some of these segments were in the first place. I guess like the limited service stuff growing versus the full service stuff really not growing. People just home more, right? I mean, I think that's a big piece of it. And there's just some sort of a convenience aspect to that. That's interesting. Okay, how about tailwinds? What's going to push us forward?
Yeah, so there's positive things in here. So, we are seeing sort of continued pent up demand from COVID, right? Like a lot of resilience and interest in getting back out there, consumers craving experiences, right? Which restaurants are fabulous at delivering. Technology and AI, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of what that's going to look like and how it's going to shape the industry, but it certainly is. And then a lot of the off-premise stuff, I think we've really changed our habits with COVID, and we're seeing some real sticking power with some of those changes, which is good because I think those will stay while we sort of keep pivoting to other additional avenues and experiences too. So.
Yeah. I ask a question. Actually, one of the nice things, we have people from all over the country, in some cases, across the world on this webinar. As it relates to COVID, we have cases are starting to go up again right now. You're seeing some places, like schools and whatnot, putting in mask requirements again. In your local area, are you seeing an increase in concern about COVID from just like people on the street? Or is it like, yeah, we're way past that? So if you to describe like the city or the town that you're in, and if you're seeing any sort of a heightened level of concern, or is it really no big deal? I'm actually sort of curious to see what we're all spotting on the ground out there. So we'll keep going, but we'll see. We'll review the chat log, I guess, later. Okay. And what drives food service visits, Anne?
Yeah, I love this slide and this data point, sort of like as a food service industry trying to understand, to your earlier point of like, people being like, people have to eat, right? We have to eat something. And I like that this sort of like shows really what our competitive advantage is and what we need to be thinking about as we kind of, look forward to these, possibly middling years where there's not a lot of growth. And so it's sort of trying to figure out how to take that share of stomach from at home, right? And it's those tasty, craveable, enjoyable, convenient. We just went out a little bit right now with consumers. So, I think focusing on those things is the way to kind of increase that share of stomach.
Yeah. So do you lean into the thing where restaurants are already winning around craveability and people just want to eat restaurant food because it tastes better? Or do you lean into the fact that like very few people think that restaurant food is more healthy or more affordable, and try to be the standout in that regard and switch people's thinking a little bit, which is probably much harder to do, but maybe brings with it much greater rewards if you can actually solve that puzzle. So it's gonna be different for every brand. Okay.
So a couple other sort of, big picture things we're keeping our eyes on and are kind of, part of our numbers and how we built them and shaped them. We are expecting prices to stabilize again, probably, stay a little higher than those at-home prices, but they will, we'll stop seeing that huge spike we saw and we'll kind of come to a new normal. I think we're going to continue to see menus that are streamlined, right? A little more focused. We're still seeing those labor challenges and supply chain issues. Continued investments in agility. I think we learned so much from COVID about, the importance of, multiple ways to reach out to consumers, multiple touch points, abilities to pivot. So I think we're going to continue to see that. Labor is going to be an issue going forward. Technology and AI investments will kind of be tied to that together. And then the demographic shifts will also continue to drive decisions for consumers. And so, we're kind of keeping an eye on all those things as we shape our numbers and see kind of which segments are going to win and which segments are going to suffer a little bit.
Yeah. So I think we have a little quiz over here that we thought was sort of fun. Just a question on how well all of you know the industry. So let's use chat. We're going to go through this really quickly because we're going to run out of time. So which of the following segments, QSR, C-store, K-12, has the most number of locations in the US? Just guess in chat and let me know if we're getting a preponderance of guesses.
So everyone's, QSR and C stores by far are the two top. I don't know that anyone's even put K-12 in. So it is one of those.
I haven't seen the numbers, but I'm going to guess that QSR is like 350. C store is 75,000 and K through 12 is like 110. I might be off though. Oh my God, I was off. I was okay. I was okay. I was off on
QSR, yeah.
All right, so it is QSR. Let's see. What has the highest average operator purchases per location? So the amount of money that operators are spending per location per year. Is it fine dining, C&U, or hospitals? This one feels like it has to be obvious to me.
Oh yeah. Oh, see, we're getting answers all over the place.
This is per unit, right?
Per unit. Yep. Per operator. Yep.
I mean, I feel like someone is going to get. I feel like the answer has to be C&U, right? There's only 4,000 colleges, and they're huge, right? It can't be fine dining. Fine dining is going to be, what, $500,000 or something in purchases, maybe less. Yeah, so C&U. So that one, I think that was an easy one. Largest share of chains versus, this is sort of fun. I'm like I get to play game show host and contestant at the same time, and Anne is like the judge. I love it.
I like this. I can just quiz you. Yeah, I feel smarter than you, Jack. It's awesome.
Which segment has largest share of chains versus single unit locations? Is it QSR, supermarket prepared, sort of like deli or prepared food offering, or C stores? This one's a little bit tougher because I could see an argument being made for most of these. What are people guessing?
Probably mostly QSR, some C-store, some supermarket.
So I think QSR is probably like
QSR.
Probably 70% chain. C-stores probably about that same number. Supermarket prepared, that's tough because you have a lot of those independent grocers, but I feel like that's probably even more chain than the other two. So I'm going to go with the middle one. And that's good. QSR is only 55. I'm actually surprised C-store is only 38%. I guess you have all those things that are more like mini marts, right? That aren't, what we're doing with
the bodegas and the
Oh, the bodegas, yeah, for sure. All right, last one. What has the highest share of sales at breakfast? Is it mid-scale, C-store, or lodging? This is actually hard, I think. What are people guessing?
It's interesting. I'm getting mostly C-stores. Funny, I thought this was going to be the easiest one, but I stand corrected. Mostly C-stores, a little bit of mid-scale, a little bit of lodging.
Well, you think of mid-scale as like a breakfast thing, right? Because you think of all the mid-scale
You
chains,
do.
breakfast focused. But lodging has so much breakfast
Mhm.
bar stuff, and a lot of those hotels
Mhm.
and motels don't have on-premise restaurants.
Don't
So I'm
do
going to guess
anything else.
lodging.
Yep. Mhm.
There we go, lodging. Okay, that's a
You'd
fun
be
quiz.
correct. Yep.
All right, good deal. All right.
Yep.
Uh, tell us what this all works out into and why these numbers are important and where you might be able to find them.
Yeah, so they are all in the IFMA scope operator landscape. This is sort of just a little snapshot of what it looks like. On the next slide, Jack, we have a link to how to get there and, you know, a list of some of the stuff that's in there. So it has, you know, we pulled all those numbers from IFMA scope. There's a bunch on, you know, details on operator spend on food versus non-alcoholic beverage versus packaging. You know, again, we have details on the day parts, on versus off-premise sales. You know, where all these different segments are sourcing from. So there's a ton more in there. You know, we just kind of scratched the surface with that. But we look at all those numbers when we're kind of putting together our industry forecast to get a sense of how the industry is looking.
Yeah, so Data Central and IFMA have had a wonderful partnership for well over a decade now. And for IFMA, we put together a really great tool and set of data called that form the heart of IFMA Scope. And if you go to ifmaworld.com, IFMA is the trade organization for the food service industry. If you go to ifmaworld.com, you'll see a prominent link that'll take you to this thing that they call Scope, which has extraordinary amounts of information, including this operator landscape that we helped build and filled with our data, where you could look at all the different segments, how big they are, stats about that segment, how fast they're growing, dollar sales, unit counts. And it's interactive. You could sort of set the parameters that you want and create sort of an instant printout or wall chart based on just the things that you're looking for. So if you go to ifmaworld.com, you could find that, and it's all powered by Data Central Insights. So go check it out if you haven't had a chance to yet. So I think we only have time to do a really quick deep dive into one segment. Why don't we make this a multiple choice? Which one of these three segments would you like to do a 3-minute deep dive into? Just type it in chat. Casual dining, C stores, or C&U. Quick, and then we'll jump to that one. Is there a majority vote?
I think casual dining's. Yeah, I think casual dining's winning. Yeah.
All right, so let's go casual dining and
close behind.
Take us through casual dining in 3 minutes or less.
All right, you got it. Yep. So here, you know, we just have the dollars for the industry, again, sort of mirroring some of what we saw earlier. Jack. So just a few things we wanted to kind of highlight with, you know, what's shaping casual dining right now. So one of the big things, off premise, right? So 22% of sales in 2024 are going to be off premise. That's versus 19% in 2019. So, you know, certainly it was higher at the peak of COVID, but I think is leveling off higher than it was pre-COVID.
That includes
that's going to continue to be an important part of the segment.
That includes like the DoorDash and Uber Eats stuff?
It does. Yep. Yep. So another thing, you know, check averages are higher, right? We've sort of seen this in a few different places. So this is, you know, excluding alcohol. But we're seeing, you know, when consumers go out, they are tending to spend a little bit more. You know, I think we're seeing check averages across all the segments as higher than they were. And that's, again, driving a lot of the growth, as we've talked about.
That's a big check average, actually. It's higher than I would have thought. Yeah, $25.
Yeah. Yeah, we asked just this summer those for a bunch of segments in those segment guides, Jack, and like the numbers are higher. Like consumers, they feel like they're spending more when they go out to eat. So, you know, quickly touching on labor, right? So this is in Mike's mid-year trends report that over half of consumers say restaurant services declined. You know, and operators still are, you know, commenting on how much of a pain point this is. And it really does affect casual dining a lot, right? Again, it's like we're going there. Let's see on the next slide for those experiences, for that service, for that, you know, sort of friendly personal touch. And so the extent that that's, you know, labor is a challenge and operators haven't been able to staff up and to provide those experiences, you know, that's limiting the industry somewhat. So this is, we ask consumers, you know, why do they go to casual dining? You gonna comment on the picture, Jack? Or yeah, so satisfying a craving and, you know, getting out of the house, socializing, you know.
Yeah, but I think what you said was interesting. People are spending more, and a slight majority think that service levels have actually gotten worse over the past several periods. So there's some fixing to do there, I think.
Yeah. Yep. We're desperate for experiences, but that won't last for long.
Holy crap. You did that in 2 minutes. Okay. Well, we have a couple more segments we can deep dive on. You know, I would say the best thing is hop into Report Pro. You'll find deep dives on all the segments there in those segment guides. I promised Ann that we would not go over, and I promised my dentist, who I need to see in about 20 minutes, that I would not be late either. So we're going to wrap things up right now. Thanks, everyone. And just as a reminder, join us in a little less than 30 days, October 5th, Thursday at noon. We're going to go into a lot more interesting insight with brand new data for you. Anne, thank you. You are spectacularly good at this stuff, and you are so well informed. And thank you for building this amazing content team and content library that we have now. It's really good stuff. And thank you to all of you.
Thanks.
I'm gonna base my.
Thanks for the time, everyone.
Yeah, I'm gonna look through all your comments and build my diet for the next couple of weeks on things that you thought are healthy and delicious. And I thank you for that.
We need to do some text analysis, Jack. Yep.
That's right. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.